"10 years ago, I was sitting on my bed in a small German village I had grown up in. In my hands, I was holding a letter that required a decision and an answer. And I was crying. I had already decided that I was going to go off to university soon to major in psychology, and I was really looking forward to my new future. But in that moment, I wasn't very happy. I was crying because the letter I was holding in my hands told me that I also had to choose a minor subject I was going to do, communication or education, and I just couldn't decide. You're probably thinking right now, that's a bit dramatic, crying over a minor subject in your bachelor's degree that you have to choose, right? But I was 17 years old, and I was scared that I would make a decision that would have an impact on the whole of my future. So I did what any half-British person would do in a moment like that, which was go downstairs and make myself a cup of tea, because that always helps. So I went downstairs, walked into the kitchen, and my mother was standing there. She took one look at my face, and being my mother, she knew right away that something wasn't quite right. "Mum," I said, "I just don't know what I should do. Should I do communication or education?" And then I had hope. My mother, she knew me better than anyone. She'd be able to tell me what to do. Phew, problem solved. But my mother, she didn't give me any answers. Instead, she started asking me questions. "What interests you about education? What do you think is so amazing about communication? And if someone told you right now, Nathalie, that you had to make a decision, which of the two would you choose and why? And if someone from the university called and said, 'Sorry, you can't do communication anymore,' how would that make you feel? Would you be relieved, or would you be sad, or would you be happy?" First of all, I thought, Mom, not you and your questions again. But as my mother kept asking me, something started to shift. Something started to change. I started to feel more calm, more collected, and I started to hear my own thoughts more clearly. By the end of our conversation, I didn't only know what I wanted to study, I also knew why I wanted to study it. That day, that conversation, shaped my entire life, because it was that day that I realized that sometimes a good question can help you more than any answer. Our world today is full of answers. We scroll on social media for them, we ask ChatGPT for them, and we really love to give them. But isn't actually the real art, the one that drives connection, creativity, thinking, innovation, actually the art of asking a good question instead? I went off to university, majored in psychology, and started working as a business psychologist, systemic coach, and facilitator. And as I started working, I started to notice that questions in this world are very rare. Genuine questions in this world have become very rare. I mean, isn't it crazy that it's my full-time job as a psychologist to sit with people, give them 100% of my attention, and ask them questions all day? Why? Because society fails to do this. I mean, most people, they don't really know which questions they should be asking themselves, so how would they know which questions to ask others, right? And then I also started to notice something else. At parties, at events like this tonight, and even with friends, I would often leave conversations knowing more about the other people than they knew about me. Not because I didn't like to share, but because there were very rarely questions asked. And if someone did ask a question, I often had the feeling they weren't really interested in the answer. And if they were interested in the answer, then they'd mostly ask a question only to be able to answer it themselves. You know, the type of person that goes, "So, how was your weekend?" And before you can start telling them about yours, they're already telling you about theirs. And this, dear audience, this is where science kicks into all of this. The phenomenon that I just described actually has a name. It's called boomerasking. Just like a boomerang that we throw out for it to come back to its source, a boomerasker's question throws itself out only to be answered by the person that actually asked the question in the first place. The Journal of Experimental Psychology actually found that boomeraskers are perceived as insincere. And there's even more research that has been done on the art of asking questions. Harvard Business School found that people who ask more questions, especially follow-up questions, are actually liked a lot better by their conversation partners. And even Socrates, the philosopher from 2,000 years ago, understood that questions are the real deal. Because he helped people to think for themselves, understand their own perspectives and their own behaviors, all through asking them questions. So what Socrates and my mother kind of had in common was one thing. They both understood that leadership can only work if we ask questions and we don't just give people answers. Today, I have made the art of asking questions my job. And I've made it my mission to bring more and better questions into this world. I work with questions in two ways. One, I educate and train people to ask more and better questions in business, in groups, and also in general society. And two, I help individual people, individual clients of mine, to understand their own behaviors more clearly, see their own perspectives and their own behaviors in a different light, all just through asking them questions. And the best thing about it? You don't even need a psychology degree to do it. Each and every one of you can start asking more and better questions after my talk. And in order for you to be able to ask more and better questions, I've brought 3 question techniques with me today that we like to use in psychology, in systemic coaching, that everyone can use in order for you to ask more and better questions at work, with your friends, and even at home. So let's get stuck right into these 3 techniques, hey? The first technique I've brought for you today are so-called hypothetical questions. Now, I want you to imagine that you're a manager and you have an employee, and this employee, he comes to you because he's working on a project and he's not very happy on how it's working. So he comes to you and says, "My project isn't working very well." Now, dear audience, maybe think about it. Which question would you ask in a moment like this? I'd guess and say probably something like, "Why isn't it going very well?" Right? That's a good question. But what does this question do? This question is a problem-focused question. What will our employee start doing? He will start telling us all about the things why his project isn't going very well. And he will also tell us all of the things that he has thought about a million of times himself. So we're not really helping him think, are we? So instead, we can ask a hypothetical question. A hypothetical question might sound a bit more like this. Imagine your project were working perfectly. What exactly would be different? Now, what happens when we ask this question? When we ask a hypothetical question, our client's thoughts go from problem thinking into possibility thinking. We start to imagine success instead of failure. And when we start to imagine success, we also start to think about what we need to do in order to get there. And that's the amazing thing about hypothetical questions. They help us to see new perspectives. Now, the second question technique I've brought for you today are circular questions. I want you to imagine again, you're a manager and it's the same employee that I was just talking about, and he's now finished his project and he comes to you and says, I'm not very happy with my work. Now, we actually think he did a really great job. We think it, other managers think it, and even the clients he worked on the project for think he did a really great job. But this employee, he doesn't think it. He says, I'm not very happy with my work. So what would most of us say in a moment like this? I'd guess and say probably something like, oh, stop putting yourself down, you did a great job. But is that really going to help? Probably not. Will he really stop putting himself down? I doubt it. So what we can do instead, we can ask a circular question. And a circular question might sound a bit more like this. If the clients you worked for on this project were here right now, how would they describe your work? Or we could say, if your best friend were here, hearing you criticize yourself the way you're criticizing yourself right now, what would she or he tell you? What happens when we ask a question like this? We take a step back and we don't just see our linear view anymore. We start to see different perspectives. The perspective of our best friend, the perspective of our client, and so on. So we get a circular view of the situation, just like a helicopter that's flying above us. We might notice, or this client or this employee might notice, that actually his clients think he did a really good job, and his best friend would say, don't be so perfectionistic and just enjoy that you've finished this damn project, you know? And that's the amazing thing about circular questions. They help us not just to see a linear view, they help us to see a circular view of the situation. Now, the last question technique I have for you today is so-called solution-orientated question. And one last time, I want you to imagine you're still a manager and you have the same project and person again, the same employee. And he comes to you because he has to create a new project and he says, I'm worried I'll make the same mistakes again, because he's about to start a new project that's similar to the old one. What would most of us say in a moment like this or ask? Probably, which mistakes could you avoid, right? He's talking about mistakes, so we want to ask him about his mistakes. But again, this is a fear-focused question. He will start talking about his mistakes and not about possible solutions. And this is where solution-orientated questions come into the game. A solution-orientated question might sound something like, what worked well the last time when you did a project like this that you'd like to repeat this time? Or we could say, what did you learn from your last project that you want to implement again, or that you want to implement in your next project? In this way of asking questions, we create solutions instead of fear and problems. We actually open the horizon of the person that we need to help to not just see the negative side of a situation, but to also see a positive, optimistic, solution-orientated side. So as we can see, solution-orientated, circular, and hypothetical questions help us not just to find answers, but to actually create a new way of thinking. And that's what real leadership is about. Not just creating answers, but creating a space where true leadership and true questions and true thinking can happen. Today, when I sit with my clients, I often still hear my mother's voice in my head from that day in the kitchen. Her calm tone, her genuine curiosity, and her firm belief that that day all I needed in the kitchen was some good answers, and that that day in that kitchen all the answers I needed were already inside of myself. Because that's the truth. All of our answers are already inside of ourselves. Sometimes we just need someone to ask the right question in order for us to find those answers. So the next time someone comes to you for advice or an answer, also just take a step back, and before you give it, maybe think about a question that you could ask instead. You might help that person find something far more valuable than your answer, their own. And because everything starts with a question, dear audience, what will your next question be? Thank you.